This is a story of a man who thought he knew everything about the world. Hank, a 50-year-old farmer from Kansas, believed in the things he could see, touch, and control. His crops, his livestock, his land. But one day, a tragic accident changed everything. He died, or at least he thought he did, and what happened next shook him to his core. Hank claims he crossed into a realm far beyond anything he could have imagined, where he was forced to confront the darkest parts of himself and the terrifying truth about the path America is on. He met a presence so powerful it unraveled his deepest beliefs and showed him visions of a future that will haunt you. What Hank saw there, he says, changed his life forever. And it might change yours too. Hank's day began like any other, with the Kansas sunrise painting the fields golden as he started his work. For Hank, life revolved around the land, an endless cycle of planting, harvesting, and tending to livestock. He loved the simplicity of it, the way the seasons set the rhythm of his days. But he also carried something heavier, something darker, in his heart. He would never have admitted it out loud, but Hank had long harbored resentment toward people who didn't look or live like him. "Stick to your own," he'd mutter whenever the topic of outsiders came up. On that particular morning, Hank was rushing. A storm was brewing on the horizon, and he needed to secure the barn roof before it hit. The wind was picking up, sending dried corn stalks skittering across the yard like ghosts. He climbed an old rickety ladder to nail down a loose section of tin. As he hammered the first nail, the ladder wobbled. Hank froze for a second, cursing himself for not replacing it years ago. Just one more nail, he thought. But he never got the chance. The ladder gave way with the ground. The fall was swift, the impact brutal. Hank's body crumpled onto the cold, hard dirt floor of the barn, his breath knocked out of him. The world around him went dim, the sounds of the storm outside fading into an eerie silence. As the pain radiated through his body, he felt something strange, a heaviness lifting, like his very essence was being pulled out of him. Hank's neighbors, alerted by the sound of the crash, found him minutes later. His wife, Margaret, rushed to the scene, her face pale with terror. She knelt by his side, her trembling hands pressing against his chest. "Stay with me, Hank," she cried, her voice breaking. But Hank wasn't responding. His eyes were open, staring at something far beyond the barn ceiling, his lips moving as if he were whispering to someone unseen. By the time the ambulance arrived, Hank's pulse had stopped. Paramedics worked frantically to revive him as Margaret clung to his lifeless hand. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered through her tears. But Hank wasn't there anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere that would change him forever. Hank's first memory of the afterlife wasn't light or peace. It was a profound, all-encompassing silence. He opened his eyes, or what felt like his eyes, to find himself standing in a place that defied explanation. The world around him was bathed in an ethereal glow, the colors richer and more vibrant than anything he'd seen before. Yet there was no sky, no ground, no horizon, just an endless expanse of light and energy. At first, Hank thought he was dreaming. "Is this it?" he muttered to himself, his voice echoing in the stillness. But as he tried to move, he realized he wasn't walking. He was floating, weightless and untethered. He felt no pain, no fear, only an overwhelming sense of clarity, as if his entire life had been a blurry image, and now he was finally seeing it for what it was. Then he noticed the presence. It wasn't a person, not in the way Hank understood people, but it was undeniably alive. The presence radiated warmth and understanding, and yet it carried a weight of authority that made Hank feel small, smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. He wanted to speak, to ask where he was and what was happening, but before he could, the presence answered the question he hadn't yet formed. "You are here to see," it said, its voice echoing not in Hank's ears, but in his very soul. "To understand." Before Hank could respond, the light around him shifted, forming into images, fragments of his own life, his own actions. At first, he saw the good, the long days of hard work, the love he'd shown his family, the times he'd stood by his neighbors in need. But then, the tone darkened. He saw moments he had buried deep in his memory, moments of judgment, anger, and bitterness toward those he considered different. He watched himself turn away from someone who had asked for his help, his heart hardened by prejudice. "This can't be right," Hank said, his voice trembling. "I'm not a bad man." The presence didn't respond. It simply stood there, silent but knowing, as the images of his life continued to play before him. And then, as if to drive the point home, the light around him shifted again, showing him something far more terrifying: the ripple effects of his actions. From the shifting light emerged a figure, neither man nor woman, yet possessing a form so radiant that it seemed to embody every facet of humanity. The spirit of unity, as Hank would later come to call it, radiated a love so powerful it was almost painful. Its presence forced Hank to confront the walls he had spent a lifetime building, the walls that separated us from them, the familiar from the foreign, the acceptable from the unacceptable. "Why am I seeing this?" Hank asked, his voice breaking. "I worked hard. I provided for my family. I did what I thought was right." The spirit of unity regarded him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through every layer of his being. "You worked hard," it said, its voice filled with both kindness and gravity. "But you did not work hard enough to see others as they truly are." With a wave of its hand, or perhaps just a thought, the spirit showed Hank images of people he had judged, dismissed, or ignored. A neighbor who had offered him help, only to be met with cold indifference because they spoke with an accent. A group of migrant workers who had sought shelter during a storm, turned away because they didn't belong. A young boy in town who had tried to make friends with Hank's son, only to be told, "We don't mix with their kind." Hank tried to look away, but the spirit wouldn't let him. "Every action plants a seed," it said. "You've planted seeds of division, Hank, and now you must see the harvest." The spirit of unity took Hank further back, beyond his own life, to the very foundations of the country he had always taken pride in. Hank watched as scenes from America's history unfolded before him, not the sanitized version he learned in school, but the raw, unvarnished truth. He saw enslaved people laboring under the scorching sun, their strength and dignity unbroken despite the cruelty they faced. He saw native communities forced from their lands, their cries echoing in the stillness. He saw suffragettes marching, their voices demanding the justice long denied. But the visions didn't stop in the past. The spirit showed Hank images of his own time, streets filled with protests, families divided over politics, and communities struggling to heal wounds that had festered for generations. Hank felt the weight of it all, the pain of a nation that had allowed division to take root. "What does this have to do with me?" Hank asked, though deep down he already knew. The spirit's answer was simple but profound. The seeds of division do not grow in isolation. They are watered by silence, by indifference, and by the unwillingness to change. Hank's journey didn't stop with the past. The spirit showed him a vision of America in the near future, just after the 2024 presidential election. At first, the scenes were chaotic: protests in the streets, angry debates on the news, and a nation seemingly on the brink of tearing itself apart. Hank felt a deep sense of despair, wondering if there was any hope for unity. But then, slowly, the tide began to turn. The new president, though far from perfect, began to address the nation with a humility and sincerity that Hank hadn't seen in years. Instead of stoking divisions, the president called for healing, for dialogue, for a return to shared values. They traveled across the country, visiting communities often ignored by those in power, small towns like Hank's, inner cities, and disaster-stricken areas. The spirit showed Hank how this leadership inspired others to take action. He saw mayors, teachers, and even farmers stepping up to bridge divides in their own communities. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but Hank could see the beginnings of something new. a nation slowly learning to see itself not as separate parts, but as one. The spirit of unity turned to Hank, its gaze unwavering, and said, "Now you must see what hate truly costs." With those words, the light around Hank transformed into scenes that struck him with a force greater than any fall. He saw not just his actions, but the ripple effects they had created, how his words and choices had affected people he'd never even met. Hank saw a man he had once dismissed, a worker who'd come to his farm looking for a job. Hank had turned him away with a curt, "We don't hire outsiders." That man had struggled to find work elsewhere, eventually leaving the area with his family. Hank saw how that decision forced them into poverty, the children going hungry, their dreams slipping further out of reach. Next, Hank saw a woman he had criticized for moving into his community, a single mother of two. He had ignored her in the grocery store, refused to help her when her car broke down, and muttered under his breath about people like her. The spirit revealed how her struggles had multiplied in a town that offered no support. Hank saw her tears, her exhaustion, and her determination to give her kids a better life despite the cold shoulders she received. Finally, the spirit showed Hank a scene that hit closest to home. His own son, now an adult, repeating the same bitter words Hank had used. Hank saw his boy turn away a classmate who needed help, dismissing him with a sneer. The spirit's voice rang in his ears. "Hate is taught, but so is love. What seeds are you leaving behind?" Hank wanted to shout, to explain himself, but the weight of what he'd seen left him speechless. For the first time, he fully understood that hate doesn't just harm those it targets. It poisons the soul of the one who carries it and spreads to everyone they touch. As if sensing Hank's despair, the spirit shifted the vision again. This time, Hank saw scenes of hope, moments where unity triumphed over division. He watched as communities came together to rebuild after disasters, neighbors helping neighbors without a second thought about differences in race, culture, or politics. One image stood out: a group of farmers, much like Hank, working alongside immigrant laborers to restore a field devastated by floods. Their hands were calloused and dirty, their faces weathered by sun and struggle, but they smiled as they worked together. Hank could feel their shared purpose, their understanding that the land cared little for the color of their skin or the language they spoke. The spirit showed Hank a neighborhood once plagued by mistrust, now thriving thanks to a community garden started by a single mother, the same woman Hank had ignored in the grocery store. He saw children laughing, parents sharing stories, and people exchanging fresh vegetables grown with their own hands. "This is what love can grow," the spirit said. Hank felt his chest tighten, not with shame this time, but with a glimmer of hope. He realized that unity wasn't an abstract idea. It was built through small, deliberate acts of kindness and collaboration. The spirit then turned Hank's attention to the land, the very foundation of his life. Hank watched as fields once barren and lifeless began to flourish. Farmers were using sustainable practices, rotating crops, and planting trees to restore the soil. Hank saw wind turbines spinning gracefully against the horizon and solar panels glinting in the sun, powering entire communities. "This is your legacy," the spirit said. "Farmers hold the key to healing not just the land, but the people who depend on it." Hank saw himself in this vision, working alongside younger farmers to teach them the value of stewardship. He showed them how to care for the soil, how to respect the delicate balance of nature. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a mentor, a bridge between generations. The spirit also revealed the global impact of these efforts. Hank saw partnerships between American farmers and communities abroad, sharing techniques and resources to combat climate change and food insecurity. It was a vision of connection, of humanity working together to heal the planet and each other. Next, the spirit showed Hank a vision of economic renewal. He saw small towns, once struggling, beginning to thrive again. Local businesses were reopening, thanks to new policies that prioritize rural communities. Farmers were receiving support to transition to sustainable practices, and young families were moving back to the countryside. drawn by the promise of opportunity and a simpler, more connected way of life. Hank saw technology playing a role, but not in the way he feared. It wasn't replacing jobs, it was enhancing them. Farmers were using drones to monitor crops, apps to track soil health, and machines powered by renewable energy. These innovations didn't just make farming easier, they made it more efficient and environmentally friendly. The spirit highlighted the importance of collaboration. Hank saw cooperatives where farmers pooled their resources to buy equipment, share knowledge, and market their products directly to consumers. It was a vision of independence and interdependence, a balance that gave communities the tools to succeed without losing their identity. Finally, the spirit brought Hank to a place that looked familiar yet otherworldly, a version of his own farm, but more vibrant, more alive. There, he saw people he recognized, the man he'd turned away, the woman he'd ignored, and others he couldn't place, but knew he'd hurt in some way. They stood before him, not with anger, but with a quiet strength. Hank fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know." One by one, they stepped forward, each offering a hand to help him up. "It's never too late to change," one of them said. The spirit's voice echoed in Hank's mind. Forgiveness is the key to freedom, not just for them, but for you. Hank felt a weight lift from his soul, replaced by a resolve to live differently. He realized that the road to redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future filled with love, understanding, and unity. As Hank stood in awe, the spirit shifted the vision once again. This time, Hank saw scenes of faith, not the rigid, exclusive kind he had grown up with, but a faith rooted in love, humility, and connection. He saw people gathering in different places of worship, their prayers rising together like a symphony. It didn't matter if they were in churches, mosques, temples, or even open fields. Their faith transcended the walls and labels humans had built. "This is the foundation of true growth," the Spirit said. "Not division through religion, but unity through the values it teaches." Hank watched as faith inspired people to act. A church group delivered food to struggling families. A mosque opened its doors as a shelter during a storm. And neighbors of all beliefs came together to rebuild a home destroyed by fire. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, consistent acts of love that transformed lives. The Spirit showed Hank himself in these scenes, humbled and changed. He saw himself praying, not just for his own needs, but for the well-being of everyone around him. He wasn't asking for miracles. He was asking for strength to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Despite the hope and unity, the Spirit made it clear that the path forward wasn't easy. Hank was shown moments of struggle, where old habits and prejudices threatened to undo progress. People argued over how to move forward, mistrust lingered in some hearts, and the weight of history made change feel slow and painful. In one vision, Hank saw a community meeting where tensions were high. People shouted, accusing one another of not understanding their struggles. But then, a single voice broke through the noise. A young woman who shared her story of overcoming hardship. Her vulnerability softened the room, and soon others were sharing their own experiences. By the end of the meeting, there was no perfect solution, but there was understanding, and that was enough to keep moving forward. The Spirit's voice was steady as it said, "Progress is not a straight path. It's a series of steps, some forward, some back. What matters is the will to keep walking." Hank felt the weight of this lesson. He understood that overcoming division wasn't about erasing differences, but learning to live with them, to see them as strengths rather than weaknesses. The Spirit then turned Hank's attention to leadership. Hank saw the newly elected president addressing the nation, their words measured and sincere. Unlike the fiery rhetoric Hank had grown accustomed to, this leader spoke with humility, acknowledging the challenges ahead while calling on every American to play their part in healing the country. The president's actions spoke louder than their words. Hank watched as they visited small towns and big cities alike, listening to farmers, factory workers, teachers, and students. They didn't promise to fix everything, but vowed to support the efforts of the people who were already making a difference. The spirit emphasized that leadership wasn't limited to politicians. Hank saw mayors organizing cleanup efforts in their communities, teachers fostering empathy in classrooms, and even parents guiding their children to be kinder and more open-minded. Leadership, the spirit explained, was about action, not titles. The spirit then showed Hank a future where farmers were at the forefront of change. Hank saw his own fields, but they were transformed, lush, vibrant, and teeming with life. Farmers like him had embraced regenerative practices, using techniques that healed the soil, conserved water, and increased yields without harming the environment. Hank saw himself teaching these methods to others, sharing what he had learned through trial and error. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a steward of the land, a protector of resources for future generations. The spirit showed him how this shift benefited not just the environment but the economy. Rural communities were thriving, with new opportunities bringing young families back to the countryside. But the most powerful part of the vision was seeing the unity it created. Farmers, once divided by politics and personal beliefs, were working together, sharing equipment, knowledge, and labor. Hank saw himself welcoming workers from different backgrounds, their combined efforts yielding a harvest greater than anything he could have achieved alone. "This is your purpose," the spirit said, "to feed not just bodies, but souls." The vision expanded once again, taking Hank beyond the borders of his own country. He saw America working hand in hand with other nations, tackling challenges that no single country could face alone. There were summits where leaders spoke different languages but shared the same goals: combating climate change, ending hunger, and fostering peace. Hank saw farmers in America sharing their techniques with communities in Africa and Asia, exchanging knowledge that benefited everyone. He saw scientists from around the world collaborating on new technologies that made clean energy more accessible. The spirit showed Hank the faces of children in remote villages, their eyes bright with hope as they received the tools and education to build a better future. "This is what happens when humanity chooses connection over division," the spirit said. "The world grows smaller, but the possibilities grow larger." The spirit's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "You've seen the possibilities," it said, "but you must also see the dangers of forgetting." With that, Hank was shown a vision of what could happen if people grew complacent, if they stopped working for unity and allowed old divisions to return. He saw neighborhoods once thriving with cooperation become fractured again. Fences went up where there had been none, and people turned inward, consumed by fear and mistrust. Fields that had been restored fell into neglect, the land barren and lifeless. Hank watched in horror as the progress he had seen unraveled, leaving communities isolated and struggling. The spirit explained that complacency was one of humanity's greatest enemies. "Healing requires constant effort," it said. "Love must be nurtured, just like your crops. If you stop tending it, it withers." Hank realized that the work of unity wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that required vigilance and commitment. He vowed in that moment never to take progress for granted, and to always be a voice for connection and compassion. Next, the spirit showed Hank the role of education in creating lasting change. He saw classrooms where children were taught not just math and science, but empathy and critical thinking. Teachers encouraged students to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, and to see the world through the eyes of others. Hank watched as schools organized community events, bringing together people from all walks of life to share their stories. He saw students leading initiatives to clean up parks, mentor younger kids, and support local businesses. The spirit highlighted the importance of these small but meaningful acts in building a culture of understanding. The spirit's final words to Hank were simple: "It's not your time. You have work to do." With that, Hank felt a jolt, as if he were being pulled backward through a tunnel of light. He opened his eyes to the sterile brightness of a hospital room, his wife Margaret gripping his hand, her face streaked with tears. "You're back," she whispered, her voice a mix of relief and disbelief. Hank's body ached, and his mind was flooded with memories of what he had seen. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But the clarity of the visions, the emotions they stirred in him, left no doubt they were real. As he recovered, Hank began to share his experience. At first, people were skeptical, dismissing his story as the product of a fevered mind. But as Hank spoke, his sincerity and the depth of his transformation became impossible to ignore. He wasn't the same man who had climbed that ladder. He was softer, more open, and determined to live differently.